Welcome back. Now, the Nigerian Senate has passed the 2020 appropriation bill, increasing it from 10.33 trillion naira presented by President Muhammadu Buhari in October to 10.59 trillion naira. A breakdown of the new figure, as approved by the Senate, indicates that statutory transfers, which was previously pegged at 556.7 billion naira, was jacked up to 560.4 billion. Recurrent expenditure was reduced to 4.84 trillion naira for recurrent expenditure, of course, while capital expenditure was increased to 2.46 trillion. An estimated 2.72 trillion was also provided for debt servicing, as opposed to 2.45 trillion, which was initially presented by the president. While the Senate maintained Nigeria's daily oil production rate at 2.18 million barrels per day, it, however, increased the oil benchmark price to $57 per barrel from $55 presented by the president. The fiscal deficit of the budget is now 2.28 trillion naira, while the deficit to gross domestic product (GDP) ratio now is 1.52%. The Senate Committee on Appropriations retained the inflation rate at 10.81% and retained GDP growth rate at 2.93% as proposed by the president. Now, in terms of federal allocations, the Works and Housing, Power, Agriculture, Defense ministries got the highest capital expenditure. That's the highest vote, I should say. Let's now discuss this further with Eze Onyekwere, who's the lead director of the Center for Social Justice. Mr. Onyekwere, thank you very much for joining us on the program. First off, let's start with the increment in the budget. Increased, of course, by over 250 billion, I should say. What do you make of the increment by the Senate?
It is a very unfortunate situation, considering that the 10.3 trillion budget submitted by the president, we are still thinking about how realistic it is in terms of how it will be funded. And now we have more money added on top of the budget, which was already being problematic in terms of funding. So it's not just about increasing the expenditure, it's also about thinking through where the new money to fund the budget will come from. It's an unfortunate situation.
Now, let's look at the other parameters. The oil price benchmark was increased from $55 to $57. Don't you think that's overly optimistic, especially given what we see with oil prices now in the international oil market?
Yeah, beyond what we even see, if you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, the fiscal authorities in Nigeria quoted the projections of OPEC and the International Energy Agency, where it was stated that there was likely going to be a glut in 2020 in terms of oversupply to the market, and that the price was likely to come much lower. And so, no one knows exactly the basis upon which the National Assembly decided to jack up the price from 55 to 57. It would have been better to be a little bit conservative, and if new money came in within the year, we could save it in the excess crude account, and maybe towards the last quarter of the year, we could do a supplementary budget to increase the resources available for spending in the year. So it's just overtly optimistic, and the implication is that if the price of crude oil hovers lower than 57, the budget will be dead on arrival, which is also another unfortunate scenario.
Debt servicing has always been a recurring issue, and it's a big headache. You look at how much has been budgeted for debt servicing, 2.7 trillion. That's almost a quarter of the entire budget. You must be quite worried with this figure.
Yeah, it is quite worrying, particularly if you consider how much we are earning as retained revenue. In 2018, we had a scenario where we earned only 3.9 trillion, and we used about 2.1 trillion to service debts and another 3.1 trillion in recurrent non-debt expenditure, bringing the two to about 5.2 trillion. And this was before capital expenditure. So in essence, we had to borrow about 1.3 trillion to make up for paying salaries and then servicing our debts. So this is the first time in recent history when the debt on paper, the money for debt service, is higher than the projection for capital expenditure. And all along, we've had a situation where you first of all pay salaries, run down overheads, pay for statutory expenditure like money to NAS, and then go ahead and pay the debts. So whatever is remaining, if anything at all, or even borrowed money, is used for capital expenditure. So this time around, on paper, debt service is far higher than capital expenditure. So we may not expect much of capital expenditure next year if our revenue does not improve dramatically. And there's nothing in the works to show that our revenue is going to increase so much, because if you look at even the increase in VAT, the money will accrue mainly to the states and local governments. If you also look at the amendment of the Deep Offshore Inland Basins Bill, not so much will come out of the, if it comes, it will still go to the federation account for sharing between the three tiers of government. Even the monies expected under the finance bill is not going to be dramatic. So all in all, we may not see more than, if the weather is so good, we may not see more than the addition of 1 trillion naira into the coffers of the federal government in 2020. If we get as much as 1 million more, we'll thank God. So if you look at the increase in terms of our expenditure vis-a-vis what we intend to get, or vis-a-vis what is feasible that we'll get at the end of the year in terms of revenue, you know that we are going to run very, very high deficits. We may need to borrow more, and we may need to look for other sources of funding the budget.
And of course, you're absolutely right when you talked about the issue of capital expenditure, because the fact is that even though we have about 2.5 trillion naira for capital expenditure, it's also dependent on whether the money would actually come in, because it's not as if we're absolutely sure that all that money is going to come in now or be spent on capital expenditure. But it's not the case with recurrent, because somehow with recurrent, we just have to raise the money to pay salaries, pay for overheads and all of that.
Yeah, definitely. If you do not pay salaries, workers will be out there in the streets. If you don't draw down overheads, the bureaucracy will grind to a halt. Nothing will happen. And you must pay the National Assembly, give them their money. All those on statutory transfers, National Judicial Council, NDDC, you must definitely transfer their money. That is what the law says. So it is only capital that you can think of whether you will implement it or not, depending on the available revenue. For debts, you must pay your debt obligations. If you don't pay, there will be challenges for you in terms of the downgrading from international rating agencies, the World Bank, the IMF. Pressures will be brought on the country. You may have to devalue your currency. So it's not an option. The only option you have is to cut down on your capital expenditure. Considering where we are just like people left behind in time and space in terms of our lack of basic infrastructure. And that's also pigeonholes or brings us down to the presidential request for about $30 billion for funding of infrastructure over the next couple of years, a request that was rejected in the 2016-2018 period. So that shows that Nigeria needs to not just think out of the box, to come out of the box. And what do I mean by that? We have an infrastructure development master plan, which was supposed to run from 2014 to about 2043. We've not activated the mechanisms in that master plan, which was supposed to raise funding through a combination of new policies, new policy measures, which the government will now use amendment of laws to put the private sector in the engine of infrastructure development. So budgetary funding or money you've got from debts was supposed to leverage, was supposed to be the money that will now make the private sector to come out, leverage their own money. So for every dollar that the federal government brought forward, the private sector was supposed to bring about 10, 11. So at the end of the day, you have more of public-private partnerships and citizens' commitment to building a new Nigeria. And we've not done that because there's a lot of lack of transparency and accountability in the way we are managing our fiscal governance. And of course, the necessary laws and policies have not been amended. The new laws and policies have not been brought in place. So which will have encouraged them, the private sector, and given them comfort to now begin to look for their own money to put down to build this new infrastructure.
Now, lastly, before I let you go, it appears we are on track to getting the January to December budget cycle with the passage of this bill now by the Senate. What's your take on that? It must be something very good.
Yeah, it's something very good, but we must go beyond this because what has happened is at the pleasure of those in power, in terms of those in the executive and the legislature. There's no policy framework. There's no legal framework that commands that they do it. And so, beyond just this passage, they must go back to the Constitution, amend it. Don't just say the president can bring the budget at any time. Just give him a timeline, give the legislature a timeline too in the same constitution or any other law, and then let them follow up on that time frame, because what is happening now is not binding on any future legislature. What is happening now is not binding on the next president, or even if President Buhari decides next year not to bring it on time, he will not have flouted any law.
Eze Onyekwere, Lead Director, Center for Social Justice, thank you very much for talking to us on the program as always, and thank you very much for your time. Well, that's it on the program. If you want to watch it again, it's very simple. Go to our website, tv360nigeria.com. You'll find this program and lots more there. You can also follow us on our various social media platforms. So thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.